We are in a materialistic world, in a sense that from the day that we are born, in this day and age anyway, we are taught to believe that we are the material body. And because of the needs and desires of the material body, we have learned as individuals and as groups of individuals and as society, and now as a civilization, in order to fulfill the needs and the desires of the material body. And from that, because that is the prevailing paradigm and the prevailing worldview and understanding, society has structured itself around that to the point where it is, in a way, a runaway train. Now, this would seem to be completely justifiable if there was no other perspective to see it from. If this was actually the case and the truth about the reality of our existence. But, of course, this isn't the case, and many people feel this in an intuitive sense or understand it thoroughly or in part, that there is a spiritual nature to ourselves. There is a spiritual part of our identity that, or of our existence, that is not as a society fulfilled. Now, some parts of civilization today, some parts of society do have pockets of groups of individuals and whatnot who attempt to fulfill that spiritual need and that spiritual desire. But it is not functional in the sense that it actually satiates the soul and the spirit, because they are not properly understood, or they're not understood enough. As I had mentioned in previous videos, the nature of our spirit is infinite, and the nature of our soul is also infinite. Our spirit is infinitely small, and our soul is infinitely large. And the spiritual desire that we have, or the desire for the soul, is to reunite our spirit with our soul in order to be complete, in order to have a proper volitional relationship with the world and with ourselves. And so, because we are born in a world that understands and views existence as something primarily material, we tend to act for the basic needs and desires of our bodies and our social structures that our bodies are in. We tend to act in response to this type of worldview and this type of society that we are in. In a society where the pleasures and needs of the self are primarily, if not completely, materialistic, whether it be for food, entertainment, or sex, or for social functionability, we adapt ourselves to this. All the meanwhile, some individuals do have a spiritual awakening that does happen at some moment in their life. This can happen at any moment for various people. And that there is a desire for there to be more meaning, or to be more spiritual understanding of the nature of the self and the nature of the world. But as a society, the answers that individuals will seek and find will always be limited to the individual. And so although some individuals might achieve very high spiritual development, it tends to almost always, or not completely start at zero again, but because people who do achieve a high success in spiritual development in one's life do leave works of their work behind, either in book form or in their relationship with other individuals. Generally speaking, the materialist and technocratic materialism that the society evolves into does not leave much to work with for individuals who are seeking answers. Now, the technocratic materialism is a completely normal and understandable reaction in a material world where our bodies are, of course, material, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that the problem with it is that it's half the equation, and that we have, as a society, not matured enough in order to balance that equation to the point where there's a spiritual education to inform newcomers, so to speak, of what the actual nature of existence is and the nature of their spiritual identity. And the answer to that question, at least in the short form, is that the individual is infinite. Each individual is infinite, as each particle in the cosmos is infinite. And each particle in the cosmos is infinite because every element or every particle in the cosmos has an infinite relation to space. And it has an infinite relation to space because every particle is an infinitesimal point which relates to the infinitely large. And that so there are an infinite amount of infinities out in the world that relate to each other, and that's how we get form. And the motions between them occur because of the motions between the infinitely small and the infinitely large, and with other particles. It's quite complex, but in the short form, that's what it is. And so as an individual, as an intelligent soul, our infinitely small spirit and our infinitely large soul have a relation to each other. And insofar there's intelligence involved, in the sense that there's a choice that is being able to be made, there is a desire for the infinitely small and the infinitely large to reunite. And this is where emotion comes in. And the emotion of the individual hungers for itself. The infinitely small hungers for the infinitely large. But this type of knowledge is not understood, generally speaking. Some individuals probably have understood it, especially in the yogic traditions. This has been dealt with a lot and worked with. But as a society, because this tends to be a very either individualistic work or pursuit, or a small group of individuals, it has not reached any mainstream narrative, even in through religions, because religions tend to be closed systems which have filters in order to the filters of how to relate to the infinite or the absolute. Right? So these filters, in fact, create obstructions with the type of creativity that the self would have with infinity. And that creativity is essential in order to create a good path in a holistic sense for the self. So although some religions do offer great guidance for a certain period of time, there comes a moment when it has to evolve beyond it. Although not to discard religions completely at any moment in time, because there's a lot of work that has been put into it through very wise people. But just as an athlete can be very wise in their own sport, in its performance, so too religions or aspects within the religions will focus very specifically on certain aspects and periods of time on how to develop certain specific techniques. For instance, in Catholicism or Judaism, the idea of holiness is emphasized a great deal. And so when it comes to holiness, then Christianity and Judaism has very many good things to say, and is very beneficial to learn from, and to study and to follow. But when it comes to, for instance, the ability to have a creative relationship, let's say with dreams, or with a manifestation, or with outer-body experiences, then Christianity and Judaism are not the go-to for the best resources. In this case, one would go to more towards, say, the occult or chaos magic, or even the New Age, as much as of a bad rep as they have had. They're very good with lucid dreaming. So there are systems out there that do offer, of course, very specific help, but as a whole they are closed. So they will focus on a few things, develop it to a great extent, and will offer a road to one's own completion of the spiritual quest or the spiritual unison. But it is very, very narrow road, and it doesn't have to be like this. The narrow road is, of course, there to motivate oneself to keep going in a straight line, and that is, of course, very beneficial if that is necessary. But that is not always necessary. Sometimes the world in itself is the road and the open space from which we can create the positive things. So that being said, the world does not offer a complete, does not offer in the main narrative a complete way to complete the spiritual cycles for individuals, and so therefore doesn't have completed spiritual cycles as a society. And until that happens, the technocratic materialism will continue to reign, not supreme, because there will always be individuals who will forsake the absolute materialism, and therefore do the work that will leave behind works for other individuals to pick up. But there could come a time when there will be a critical mass of spiritual awakenings, and when that happens, an open-ended system could end up being created. And I mean, even to call it a system would not be appropriate in the absolute sense, but it would just be a system that would have enough momentum, or there would be enough momentum that it would give the appearance of having a system that would evolve through time, because creativity is part of the system, or will be part of the momentum. The creativity of the spirit, the creativity of the choices of maintaining the societal social groups that will balance the spiritual and the material, which is really a balance between the causal and the forms in the cosmos or in existence. It is the balance between the infinite and the finite. The infinite is the causal, it is the spirit, and the finite is the result of it. And the guidance within all this is the souls of the individuals, and when the individuals as a group have pulled enough of the manifest enough of their souls into the society through various technologies and art and social dynamics, then a truly spiritual age could occur, where society then is built and created and maintained from a perspective of peace and joy and love, because those individuals and those groups and the society that would come from it would no longer make decisions and creations from purely the materialistic point of view, because their identity is seated within the causal, within the infinite, within the soul. And therefore the negative emotions would no longer reign supreme, or the negative emotions would not have an oversway on the self in order to make decisions about not only one's own individual life, but as the life also for society. And so the dynamics between the material and the spiritual find a balance, because once the spiritual quest of individuals is complete, then the soul is no longer the only point, the only I don't want to say object, but the only thing that is of interest. Or actually, I want to say it backwards. When we are born in a material worldview, there comes a point where the idea of the spirit and the soul become the most important thing, because it is what we are lacking. It is the part of the equation that is missing. And so completing the spiritual quest becomes the most important aspect of one's life, fulfilling the destiny of the self. But once that destiny is fulfilled, once that most important spiritual aspect is fulfilled, then the material world becomes of great importance again. Not of highest importance, because what's of highest importance is the balance between the material world and the spiritual world, between the finite and the infinite. But once the spiritual quest is completed, then the spirit is no longer the most important part, but it is the relationship between the spirit and the material world. So it might seem like the spiritualists are forsaking materialism altogether, but this is not necessarily something that is always true. It is true in the beginning, or it seems to be true, because there is a thirst for completing one's own destiny and fulfilling one's own infinity, to being in relation with the Absolute. But once that is done, then the material world comes into the equation side by side between the relationship of the material world and the spiritual world. It is the king and the queen that are able to rule over the kingdom with wisdom and joy and love, and that this double throne is in a positive relationship, and therefore the hierarchy of the rulership, or not the rulership per se, but the hierarchy of the self and the world are side by side in a positive relationship. And so this technocratic materialism that we find ourselves in is still a runaway train until we've reached this critical mass of individuals who create and share their spiritual journey, and the completion of that journey is when one is able to manifest one's soul and one's spirit in a visible way for others to be able to see, whether that is in art, or it is in magic, or it is in beauty, that will inspire others and awaken others, who will then allow their spirit and their soul to speak to them and create a space for them to feel their natural desire for their own completion. And so that blossoming will eventually take its place in the ecosystem of the world and existence on this planet.